guys, it's Angelo, and with patch 8.3 out now, and with Shadow Priests discussed thoroughly in our last videos, with the changes that affected us coming into patch 8.3, the Shadow Priest guide, our best essences and our rotation, today we're having a summarizing look at how 8.3 is looking for the Shadow Priest thus far. I felt that it's important to give you guys not only my personal input, but also an objectively speaking view of how things currently stand. Many things have changed for the Shadow Priest, and there's certainly a lot to talk about here, as we simply don't stand in the same bright light as we'd been standing in for the last couple of patches. Ultimately, this video aims to answer the question that's most important. What makes the Shadow Priest weak at the moment, and more importantly, what needs to change? Now, if you want to join the discussion, be sure to join our Discord server, where you can chat with other priests about anything World of Warcraft related, or even ask a question in the weekly Ask Angelo thread, where I pick out a few questions concerning any priest spec and answer them once a week. Now that being said, and without any further ado, let's go right ahead and have a look. If we want to look at the Shadow Priest's current problems, what we need to do first is take a look at how it's currently performing. To do this, we don't have to look very far, as a simple check on Warcraftlogs will show us exactly what we need to see. On screen now, we have the overall boss performances which were logged in the last 2 weeks, with performances in the 80th percentile of all performances. I decided not to take into account anything lower, because a good Shadow Priest, at least when we talk about a pure damage output aspect and nothing else, will want to at least be in this bracket or higher. I decided not to go higher though, because I want to take into consideration that not all raid compositions are perfect for the Shadow Priest, and depending on which mechanic you have to deal with and how often, this can most certainly impact your rankings as well. And this is not even addressing any corruption items either, which also tremendously affect how much damage you are able to deal. Therefore, the 80th percentile is fine in my opinion, and should give us a fair look at what's going on. As we can see, the Shadow Priest is currently performing pretty badly in comparison to previous tiers in all 3 relevant branches of raiding, so normal, heroic, and mythic difficulty. Our best overall performance, when taking all bosses into consideration, is found in normal difficulty. However, in heroic, and most importantly in mythic of course, we fall off drastically. But why? Granted, after 1 week of mythic raiding, most guilds have not killed more than 3 bosses in mythic, and out of the 3 first bosses in Ny'alotha, only 1 boss is really good for our damage patterns, and that is Prophet Skitra. On top of that, the more bosses guilds have killed, the less they've used Shadow Priests for, and if you go even higher, so bosses like Drestagath or Il'gynoth have simply not been killed more than 50 times worldwide, meaning that the reports are not plentiful enough yet to make an actual ranking. Many of you are probably watching the Method World First race, or other streams like that of Complexity Limit or Aversion, and many of you have certainly noticed that not many Shadow Priests see the light of day in those higher bosses either, and there's certainly a reason for that. The main reason for the way we currently perform has a lot to do with our specs scaling in direct connection to the nerfs which hit us in patch 8.3. As you all know, by now we've been nerfed pretty heavily going into this patch, and I know you've seen these nerfs on screen a couple of times now, but I'll show them once more just for the sake of structure in this video. All of our previous strengths have been nerfed, and this is important because it strongly cuts down on our strength in form of scaling. The Shadow Priest specifically has the highest stat scaling out of any spec in the game, meaning that no one else benefits as much from more stats than we do. This used to be our strength, as effects like Chorus of Insanity or Lingering Insanity would act as a steroid that buff our damage into unbelievable heights. This is also the reason why we played all of the Eternal Palace with an item level 400 inscription trinket, the Highborn Compendium, as it gave us such a high amount of raw haste with essentially 100% uptime that is alone boosted our damage up a good 4000 DPS. This same scaling was exactly what made us so strong in the previous raid tiers, as many of our Azerite traits, Azerite essences, trinket procs and overall stats from gear were translated into damage very well. Chorus of Insanity critical strike scaling reduced by 25% and auspicious spirits damage bonus reduced to only 25% means that we have very difficult times bringing up the damage we previously were able to do with that said scaling. Now, in order to bring us back to a level which is competitive, there's not many things that honestly need to change, and there's more than one way of making the Shadow Priest a competitive spec again. First and most obvious, of course, would be to buff both Chorus of Insanity and Auspicious Spirits again. Not to our previous levels, but at least go back up 10%, so that Auspicious Spirits will deal 35% more damage, and Chorus of Insanity's crit bonus will only be reduced by about 15%. Of course, these numbers are just ideas, but this should ensure that the foundation of the spec remains competitive. Unfortunately for us, the Shadow Priest is incredibly reliant on its Azerite traits and talents, and relies on them being strong in order to deal solid damage. Another option, and this one is less risky of overscaling potentially, is to bring back our single target damage. Revert our nerfs to Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain, and slightly buff our Void Bolt. Void Bolt is a pure single target spell, and buffing it would increase our single target damage, which is currently lacking of course. Increasing our single target damage specifically means that we remain competitive for any baseline encounter, while not spiraling out of control in multi-target situations, as we had done previously. In our current state, we're weak in both single target and multi-target encounters, so not only is there no reason for a rage to consider a Shadow Priest over any other competitive DPS spec really, but it's also very hard for us to even pull competitive DPS numbers at all, which leaves a lot of us, especially those without a guild or a community to rely on, in struggling times finding a raid or a Mythic Plus group. This of course unfortunately forces many Shadow Priests to reroll, and we all know that it's not very easy in Battle for Azeroth to be rerolling. Lastly, I want to close out this video with my personal opinion. How do I currently feel about the Shadow Priest? Personally, this is the very first time since the launch of Battle for Azeroth where I truly enjoyed the spec as much as I did in Legion before many of our core abilities had been stripped away or turned into talents at the start of BFA. Of course, I liked the Shadow Priest back then as well, but in comparison to Legion, not as much. Due to a lot of haste and critical strike in the game at this point in comparison to previously, the spec plays very fast and is actually pretty engaging. I am seeing a problem in our damage output though, and of course the question is the spec viable? And the answer is yes, it is viable. It can be played in any difficulty of PvE or PvP content, but just keep in mind that you have to put in a bit of effort and playtime in order to get your Shadow Priest on an enjoyable level. Farm the proper trinkets, use the right Azerite essences, and have the right Azerite gear, and you'll ultimately be fine. What do you think? How are you enjoying our Shadow Priest at the moment? Do you like it? Do you still play it even? I'd be excited to know what you guys think in the comments below or on our Discord server. Also, of course, the cutoff for the Q&A is tomorrow, which is when I'll be taking the final questions into consideration before the Q&A on Friday. Alright guys, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and leave a like if you enjoyed this video of course. As always, have a good one my friends, and I will see you all in the next one.